business. The subcommittee agreed that we would call the ministers on February 25th. Could I have a mover of that motion? Mr. Motz, I saw you say that. Seconder, any debate? Seeing none, we're passed. Thank you. Good. And I just say to colleagues and to witnesses alike that we're likely to be interrupted, but we will try to maintain as much order as possible. If the lights start flashing, the bells start ringing, et cetera, I may ask permission for the committee to carry on. After all, one of our witnesses is flown in all the way from California, and I'd like to respect that. And all we have to do is just go upstairs anyway. So I don't want to. Yeah. Did Mr. Porter come in as well from?
Yes, from Washington.
Oh, really? Oh, well, that hardly counts. Yeah.
One cold capital to another.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Yes. I was in the Pentagon in June, and I chair the Joint Board of Defense, and so one year it's Ottawa, next year it's one. So the Washington Capitals had just won the Stanley Cup, and so the my American counterpart thought it was hilarious to present me with a puck, a Washington Cup, and I said to him afterwards, "Yeah, your Russians are pretty good." So with that, may I call upon Mr. Porter, all the way from Washington for his 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to share FireEye's perspective with you on threats to the Canadian financial services sector, and to provide an overview of how we as a company and the private sector in general work in partnership with the government to help defend that sector. As the chair said, my name is Christopher Porter. I'm the Chief Intelligence Strategist for cybersecurity company FireEye. We have more than 4,000 customers in 67 countries. My testimony today will reflect the lessons that we've learned from responding to incidents around the world, but also intelligence that we gather on threats that are specific to Canada. In addition to working at FireEye, I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and until 2016, I served for nearly 9 years at the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, which included an assignment as the cyber threat intelligence briefer to the White House National Security Council staff, several years in counterterrorism operations and brief war zone service. In addition to the 300-plus security professionals responding to computer intrusions worldwide, FireEye also has over 200 cyber threat analysts on staff in 18 different countries. They speak over 30 languages, and they help us predict and better understand the adversary, often by considering the political and cultural environment of the threat actors. So we were born as a technology company, but we have these capabilities as well. We have an enormous catalog of threat intelligence, and it continues to grow every day alongside the continually increasing attacks on organizations around the world. But we also have deep ties to Canada. FireEye appliances defend Government of Canada email inboxes every day, and we work closely with Canada's public safety institutions to keep Canadians safe by defending their networks and also by supporting investigations. For today's discussion, I will focus not only on the cyber threats that Canada's banks, investment firms, and government financial regulators face today, but also the threats that they're likely to face in the near future. We live in a time of rapid change in how cyber operations are deployed, especially by nation states. What were once spying tools used to carefully, quietly, and illicitly acquire information are increasingly in the hands of military officers poised to go on the offensive and do serious damage and disruption. This is especially true in Canada, which is often one of the first nations targeted for new types of cyber operations. Canada is a country with a high per capita GDP, which makes it an attractive target for financially motivated criminal activity. It is a world leader in high-tech development, including in some niche areas of military applicable dual-use technology. So it's going to be a perennial target for foreign intelligence services. And as a member of NATO with a large diplomatic and investment presence worldwide, Canada is a natural target for politically motivated retaliation from a number of actors worldwide. Companies and individuals in Canada are also targeted by a spectrum of threat activity, which ranges from deliberate, sophisticated criminal intrusions to commodity malware that spreads worldwide and only incidentally affects Canadians. So, for example, in February 2017, multiple major Canadian financial institutions were exposed to risk of state-sponsored cyber theft from North Korea. At that time, the Polish Financial Supervision Authority took its systems offline after discovering malicious code had been placed on its web server and was being used to redirect select targets to malicious downloads that gained control of their computer. Notably, those attackers used a whitelist of IP addresses to designate which individuals would receive the designated payload, and multiple Canadian financial institutions appeared prominently on the targeted list. Even though the threat was in Poland, it still came home here in Canada. Commodity campaigns such as ransomware, cryptojacking, and especially credential theft malware constitute a significant threat to Canadians. Card-related fraud is a serious concern. FireEye routinely uncovers major underground fora that sell thousands of stolen credit cards at a time. Sometimes from major financial institutions, but just as often targeting customer accounts at smaller banks and credit unions. Canada is also often one of the first targets for new malware campaigns. A Canadian bank was one of the first 5 financial institutions worldwide to be targeted by TrickBot malware, and since then we've observed additional financial institutions added to TrickBot's configuration files that have a presence in or are based in Canada. Notably, Canadian URLs appeared in all TrickBot campaign IDs, and several of those organizations were either credit unions or smaller banks. In August 2017, we also observed a PandaBot configuration file that revealed targeting specifically of 15 major Canadian financial institutions. At least a half dozen organized crime groups also conduct financial crime operations targeting companies and people in Canada, and their sophistication is on par with that previously we would have said was reserved only for nation states. One group in particular, which FireEye calls Fin10, has been focused specifically on Canada since 2013, carrying out numerous intrusions against gambling and mining organizations, exfiltrating business data, and extorting victims. With ongoing intrusion operations, active underground threat activity, substantial targeting by commodity malware campaigns, and homegrown threat actors, Canada will likely continue to face a complex and challenging criminal threat landscape in the short to medium-term future. The cyber espionage threat to Canada is moderate, but could be on the rise. We've observed 10 separate cyber espionage groups from China, Russia, and Iran targeting Canada in recent years. Organizations in the government, defense, high-tech, nonprofit, transportation, energy, telecommunications, education, and media sectors, among others, have all been impacted, much like they have in many Western countries. Many Chinese cyber threat groups have renewed their attention to the theft of military applicable technologies since mid-2017 and are likely to intensify those efforts as trade-related conflicts with Canada and its allies emerge. This greatly increases the risk to Canadian commercial firms in all industries, but especially those that develop cutting-edge technologies or that directly compete with Chinese companies internationally. Aside from intellectual property theft, Chinese origin operations continue to heavily target competitive business intelligence from Canadian companies, especially those making foreign direct investments globally. Looking forward, I am gravely concerned about the militarization of cyber operations. As NATO members continue to share capability and training, major cyber powers outside the alliance are likely to do the same. This proliferation of cutting-edge offensive cyber power, combined with an increasing willingness to use it, with minimal blowback and spiraling distrust, has set the stage for more disruptive and destabilizing cyber events, possibly in the near future. In the past, some countries would have responded to Western sanctions with increases in denial of service attacks on finance sector websites, but in the future they may just as well respond with destructive attacks that are aimed at permanently disabling financial services or altering data in ways that undermine trust in the global financial system. For example, they could delay or impair the trustworthy settlement of collateralized government debt. For countries sufficiently sanctioned, and therefore increasingly outside the financial system anyway, there's little incentive not to do so during a confrontation. Efforts to undermine foreign governments may increasingly be met with disruptive cyber campaigns such as those that target elections infrastructure and individual candidates, where Canada is especially vulnerable. I urge the Government of Canada to work with its allies in the United States and Europe to find peaceful diplomatic arrangements with potential rivals and adversaries in cyberspace. Attribution, while difficult, has not proven to be the barrier that many predicted to enforcing such diplomatic arrangements. And many of Canada's likely antagonists share similar concerns about cyber threats to their own financial sector, government stability, and a desire to protect their people. Diplomatic agreements which focus on ensuring the sovereignty of signatories and which avoid destabilizing operations while protecting human dignity can be reached. They can be enforced, and they would be mutually beneficial. But they may require the West to curtail some of its own cyber activities. While not sufficient on their own to protect Canadians, diplomatic agreements restricting certain classes of cyber operations will prove necessary alongside private sector technology and services to protect Canadian citizens and businesses in the long term. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to participate in today's discussions. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Porter. Mr. Reiber, 10 minutes, please.
Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman, thank you for the invitation to testify before your committee today. It is an honor to represent my company, Illumio, and to offer my thinking about the future of cybersecurity and national security policy planning. I'm the head of cybersecurity strategy at Illumio, which provides micro-segmentation capabilities for cyber resilience, and the former head of cyber strategy in the Pentagon, where I was speechwriter to the Deputy Secretary of Defense during the Obama administration. If I may first beg your indulgence, I'd like to open my statement by honoring the memory of a great Canadian national security leader with whom I worked in the Obama administration who died last year. And we worked on cybersecurity together. I'd like to inform you about him briefly and register his name into the Canadian record. Sean Brimley's life has been celebrated across his adoptive home in the United States, including through a letter from former President Barack Obama and moving eulogies in our national press. But for his family and for our two countries, I'd like to enter this statement into the permanent record of the House of Commons. Sean Brimley was born in Mississauga, Ontario, served in the Canadian Army, and was educated at Queen's University. He later settled in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Marjorie Clark Brimley, and achieved more in his 40 years of service than most do in a lifetime. He went from serving in the Pentagon to the White House to running one of Washington's premier think tanks, which is the Center for a New American Security. He wrote the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review, helped shape the U.S. pivot to Asia, ran crisis response and strategic planning initiatives out of the White House, and was a leading thinker behind the third offset strategy for long-term U.S. defense innovation. A loving husband and father, a great friend, and a mentor, Sean Brimley made all of us safer and more secure. And for that, and for this House and this country, as well as mine, can be proud. As he testified before the U.S. Congress in 2015, it is an honor to testify in front of this House today, especially on an issue for which he and I started working 9 years ago. Now, in the years since I first entered the Pentagon, the cyber threats have become a top-tier challenge to international security. Three trends make it so: the vulnerability of the networks and data of cyberspace, the overarching digital transformation of society, and a lack of sufficient investment by organizations in the people, processes, and technologies required to deter, defend against, and recover from cyber attacks. Governments and organizations have taken steps to improve their cybersecurity posture by building teams, developing options, and adopting technologies, but progress has been too slow to keep pace with the threat. Nation-states and non-state attackers steal, destroy, and manipulate data in and through cyberspace. Adversaries flourish in what could be called the gray space below the level of outright conflict, and they appear undeterred in pursuing their goals in that way. Consider China's continuing campaign to steal U.S. intellectual property, including the data of the Joint Strike Fighter. North Korea's 2015 theft of $81 million from the Bangladesh Central Bank and U.S. Federal Reserve. China's theft of 21.5 million personnel records from the U.S. Office of Personnel Management. And Russia's disruptive attack on the Ukrainian electric grid in 2015 and 2016, to name just a few. Nation-states present the greatest threat because they have the resources to put hackers on salary. These people can go to the gym. They can work diligently over time to try and penetrate a target. In recent years, they've shifted their focus from theft and destruction to the data manipulation of political and media targets. The Russian attack on the 2016 U.S. presidential election is the most notable example. As you're familiar, on the express direction of Russian President Vladimir Putin, Russian military intelligence hacked into the networks of U.S. political organizations and political leaders. and exploited vulnerabilities in social media business practices to spread propaganda and foment mistrust in the American population. The Russian operation hit at 3 parts of the American center of gravity during a period of acute political transition. That was the American people, the political leadership, and key technology companies. Other countries have since taken similar steps, including China's reported penetration of Cambodia's electoral system in 2018, which affords it the opportunity to manipulate the outcome of those elections. Why is this problem so severe right now? There's 3 points that I would say. The first is increased urbanization. The second is the proliferation of dual-use technologies. And the third is the interconnected nature of the world economy. That means that smaller groups of individuals can have an impact significantly disproportionate to their size. This high-consequence risk nature of modernity, which is what Anthony Giddens called it, examples include the 9/11 attacks by al-Qaeda, the actions of the subprime lenders and their impact on the mortgage market, and most recently, Russia's cyberspace operation against the U.S. election. Just like the September 11th attacks, when 19 men slipped past the security establishment and turned airplanes into missiles, a small group of Russian operatives found a seam in American security to conduct a high-risk asymmetric attack. The internet grew from 0 to just under 4 billion users in 35-plus years since its founding, and access increased without a commensurate understanding of risk, whether from the vulnerabilities of code or the impact of social media on political identity formation. Networks, data, and cloud environments are vulnerable to breach, and society is vulnerable to manipulation. As a matter of priority, countries should focus on deterring nation-state attacks. Deterrence is a function of perception, and it works by convincing a potential adversary that the costs of conducting an attack will outweigh the benefit. Effective deterrence requires the ability to impose costs on an attacker through sanctions or military means, defensive tools to repel an incoming attack, like firewalls, and in the event that a hacker gets through the perimeter defense, resiliency capabilities to limit impact, like microsegmentation. 2 propositions arise from recent history to inform your inquiry. First, adversaries have escalated in cyberspace despite the U.S. government's efforts at deterrence. The United States and other countries must therefore take a more aggressive stance to deter aggression. In 2018, the U.S. government embraced this position, notably through the Defense Department's doctrine of defending forward in cyberspace. As adversaries have escalated, as my colleague pointed out, the United States chose to indict or sanction as punitive measures. These actions, while reasonable, did not set a precedent or effectively deter escalation. For example, even after sanctioning Russia for its actions in the 2016 election, Russia reportedly continued to implant malware on the U.S. electric grid through 2018. So what does it mean to defend forward in cyberspace? If it has indications and warning of an impending attack, the United States must be able to push back against an adversary. This means penetrating the cyberspace infrastructure to conduct counter-offense hacking to blunt an incoming attack. Nation-states have the right to defend themselves in cyberspace just as they do in other domains. To maintain peace and stability, however, any operation must be conducted under the law of armed conflict. The need for a more forceful deterrence posture is the first takeaway from the last 10 years of cybersecurity policy development in the United States. The second is the need to assume breach and plan for adversaries to penetrate your internal defenses and gain access to your most valuable data. What does it mean to assume breach? Most organizations focus on the perimeter defense, and they lack an internal security system to prevent servers from communicating with one another once an attacker has broken in. But once an attacker has penetrated a network, they can spend up to an average of 6 months inside a data center or cloud environment, moving around, unencumbered, implanting malware for whatever purpose they choose. An organization's crown jewel applications, like its key databases, are open game in that instance. In the Chinese attack on OPM, for example, no rules existed to govern how applications and servers would interact internally. Thus, when the Chinese made their way inside, they could easily make their way to the database that held 21.5 million records. Microsegmentation prevents breaches from spreading. At its most basic level, it puts walls around vital applications to segment them away from the rest of the cloud environment and from data centers. An intruder may be able to get 3 servers, but not 3,000. It is in this way a deep foundation for cyber resilience in the last line of defense. For critical infrastructure sectors like the financial sector, if you have this kind of capability installed, it provides an element of resilience not just for the sector itself, but for the nation as a whole. It is not a question of if, but when a breach will occur. Countries need to proactively defend themselves against aggressors to achieve deterrence, as I said. but they also need to assume breach and implement defense-in-depth strategies to withstand attacks. Leadership enables success against all parts of the cybersecurity project. In his seminal essay, The Challenge of Change, the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger said, "Science and technology revolutionize our lives, but memory, myth, and tradition frame our response." That is true. Excuse me. That is true. And our ability to manage technological change depends ultimately on the success of the leader and his or his ability to tell a story to make change. We have a crop of strong security leaders that have come up in Canada and the United States in the last 10 years. Technology's momentum and evolution may never end, but good leaders help society adapt and manage change, from the rise of aviation to the dawn of the nuclear age. Cybersecurity is simply the latest chapter in our story. Ultimately, leadership is underpinned by the analysis, and that's what makes this committee's work so important. Thank you for having me, and I welcome your questions. And I'm sorry for coughing so much.
Thank you, Mr. Reiber, and thank you for your statement about Sean Brimley. That was a kind and thoughtful gesture and appreciated by us all. Ms. Dama for Mr. Spingman.
Thanks, Chair. And I'm going to start, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague. Just a very quick question, Mr. Porter. You mentioned something about the Canadian election infrastructure is especially vulnerable. We don't have the same system as the United States, as you know. Why are we especially vulnerable?
Thank you for the question. Just to be clear, it's not that Canada per se is especially vulnerable. I guess I meant more that it's an especially important vulnerability for Canada. Obviously, the use of paper ballots takes away a lot of the concerns that we have in the States. Nonetheless, I think this is a high priority for a number of aggressors that would target Canada, both internal political activists and also China, Russia, and others that might seek to influence the process. Much like the financial sector, elections are a process which are high-trust events. We benefit tremendously from living in free and democratic societies and also from being able to conduct trade and transfer money worldwide. The flip side of that is even a small problem or even the perception of a problem, maybe not even a real breach, but even the perception of a problem does outsized damage to both elections and the finance sector.
So I'm going to stop you because I just wanted some clarification on that. So thank you. I had a meeting this week with the Canadian Association of Mutual Insurance Companies. They're actually joined us today. And the meeting was about open banking, something I didn't even know what it was, and they explained it to me. And I know the United States is looking at moving towards that. Are you familiar with it? So the concept is that you get financial tech firms like a Wealthsimple that we have here that would have access to banking data. So you've got the banks up here, which in Canada are extremely heavily regulated. The information would flow into a portal like Expedia.ca, and they could access it to tailor your request. To me, that seems ripe for all kinds of cybersecurity and privacy breaches, that type of system. And it's something that apparently Europe is doing and the United States is moving towards as well.
Yes, thank you. I'm not familiar enough with that system to comment on it specifically. Those type of arrangements in general, where you have a data broker that acts as a public trust or an industry-wide trust, generally have the effect of improving cybersecurity day to day, but also making the system more brittle, right? One compromise becomes a massive compromise. So I don't know enough to comment on that situation specifically, though.
And are you familiar with it at all, or?
I'd be lying if I said I was.
Okay, that's fine. I'm gonna turn it over to Mr. Spengleman, I think.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for being here. My interest is in small business and in good cybersecurity as a, if you will, a global common public good, a national public good. What can we do to make life easier for entrepreneurs who may be data-centric but early in their lifespan may have problems affording good cybersecurity? Are there things that government can do to step in to fill the gap? Established businesses with large data sets and large client databases and revenue have an easier time. Startups don't. I'm wondering if you could comment.
Sure. I think there's a number of different ways to try and spur investment across the country. The regulatory environment has matured significantly in recent years for this purpose, really. I think cybersecurity is a bit like life insurance. You need some kind of nudge. In life insurance, it's usually the birth of a child. In the case of expenditures, however, I think you need an outside nudge. GDPR, Colorado, and California state laws, the new law that you passed, but also New York's financial services sector, that in New York State they passed a new law that really pushes down a requirement for breach management. So this means that companies have to be compliant, and then this will affect how companies drive behavior within the market and how they end up spending money. Right. Services aren't that expensive. It's really not a question of expense. It's a question of really, as I said earlier, of leadership. So I like to talk about the new security stack and the old security stack when it comes to bundling cybersecurity investments. In the past, you had the old security stack, which is like things like encryption, intrusion detection systems, and firewalls. And now we have this new capability called microsegmentation, which provides this deep resilience for data centers. So I would recommend for any organization that's looking to make investments in cybersecurity that you think about this new security stack to cover both the perimeter and the interior. And service expenditures have really decreased in recent years as the market has evolved. But I would point you towards those regulations as
to the point
steps.
where those expenses wouldn't even be a barrier to entry, to market entry in most cases.
Well, so oftentimes if you have your IT budget as sort of 10% of your total expenditure, which in the Pentagon's case is like $40 billion, just like, then your cybersecurity investment should be about 10% of that, which is really about as much as we spend for U.S. Cyber Command.
Okay. That's really helpful. Mr. Porter, any comments on this question?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, the targeting of small businesses is an issue that's near and dear to my heart on the policy side because, first off, although it's not directly my expertise, I think the move to the cloud has made it possible to get high-quality security providers in much more scalable ways, where you pay per bandwidth or per seat or per license, as opposed to a large capital fixed cost. So even as opposed to a few years ago, the solutions are much more affordable. However, to stop a world-class actor, you need more than just the technology. You need some sort of organizational infrastructure where you're training and keeping employees and threat hunting. That is beyond what small businesses can do for themselves. So at FireEye, we offer managed defense where we'll manage your network for you. Even with that, that's a 95% solution. And I think, to me, the policy failure that this House could address, at least in the states, the policy failure has been that you tend to pick a few industries to defend and to defend the biggest companies that are there, right, because those are the ones that are most obviously a threat to national security if they're compromised. What we're not as good at in the West is sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. So actors that destroy 1,000 small businesses won't get the president or the prime minister's attention, but one big compromise will. And I think that's a policy failure that should be addressed, where in Canada, I would recommend that you at least, even though it's very difficult, at least say it's a priority for us to defend everyone, not just the biggest businesses and not just these siloed industries. It may be a Herculean task, a very large task, but it would be nice to see that at least as a stated priority to start working towards.
It's very helpful. Thank you. Thanks.
Monsieur Paulus, 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît. En français?
En français. Prenez,
In French. If you'll just give me an extra minute, perhaps, to allow people to put on their headphones. So thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us here today. I have had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Raber in Silicon Valley in October. And I was able then to invite these people up here to meet us, the FireEye people. My first concern is Canada's position with respect to cybersecurity compared to the position of the United States, given that the United States are a first target, being a superpower, by China and Russia? You're a natural target, let's say, of those countries, but Canada remains, to some extent, the good guy on the block, the good girl. Militarily speaking, though, the United States has a very large army. We have a rather small force, but we've always said that should there be a serious problem, we would work together and defend each other. In cybersecurity, do you think that at this point, the American defense structure of your private and public organizations, CIA, Homeland Security, and so on, do you think that should there be an attack, it would be possible for us to work closely and rapidly together?
The translation didn't come through, so I'm relying on my high school French, which is not terrible. So I'll try and answer. Your question, it seems to me, is within the evolution between CIA and DHS and the military, how much do they collaborate for a common defense, and could they help Canada? Is that part of the question?
If our both country, if Canada is a victim of cyber attack,
Yeah.
did the U.S. is in possibility to help Canada
Sure.
quickly?
That's what I thought.
Okay.
Yeah.
And does our law, the Canadian law, are an obstacle? Do you know?
Sure. So under Article 5 of NATO, everyone who is a member of NATO, Article 5, there was a resolution that says a cyber attack, if it triggered a certain point, would require a common defense. I think one of the interesting things about cyber attacks so far is that they haven't crossed a threshold that has immediately made a clear statement for a warranted military response in a way that would necessarily be required. I would say the Russian attack on the 2016 presidential election, looked at historically, certainly qualifies in an instance where a counteroffense action by the military would have been warranted. And I think that others in the Obama administration have said the same thing. The difficulty in that particular instance, the decision calculus is complicated, and I won't go into that because that's not really the nature of the question. But yeah,
Thanks. I'll just have 7 minutes.
yeah.
Talking about the relation with public sector and private sector. You was from CIA, you work in Patagon, so now you're in private sector. So actually, here in Canada, we try to find how we can work with the private sector because, as we know, everyone's that it's more difficult to have a public servant working in that kind of business.
Sure.
So do you think Canada must switch and to have the same to sorry for my English this afternoon.
It's fine.
To have the same way of work than you have in the U.S.
I think this is an evolution we've gone through really since 2014. There's been a significant push to build connective tissue between the private sector and the government. Certainly, I think it's immensely valuable, and we had a ramp in terms of defense innovation fellows, the U.S. Digital Service and the Defense Digital Service. Those two components that brought people in from the outside. It was tremendously helpful. And I recommend to every country that's dealing with cybersecurity issues to find a way to build connective tissue to allow tech entrepreneurs to work in the government, and likewise to have people from the national government to work in technology for certain.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's interesting in cyber work because 95% of the attacks that are happening are on private sector networks against private sector victims. So often, in the United States and elsewhere, the first to know about it might be the private sector. Governments can have more powerful responses. Their investigations can go more in depth. The private sector doesn't replace, government work, public sector work. It's complementary. But it's important to know, for example, at FireEye, some of our core teams that are discovering crimeware are based out of Canada. So it's even though we're proudly a U.S. founded company, we're an international company in terms of our workforce. That's rapid information sharing across borders that also is sometimes difficult for governments to do. So to answer your question, yes, I do think that Canada and the U.S., as the closest of allies, would come to each other's aid in principle under appropriate circumstances. I would defer to my colleague on what those are. But at a working level, absolutely, Canadian and U.S. researchers work together every day and exchange information on threats. I think you'll find that not just in times of crisis, but every day.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a deep level of cooperation between the intelligence services and the security services for incident response. And I know that through the there's a trilateral commission between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada where that cooperation has happened, and it's obviously between the two allies themselves.
Thanks. I have some wanted your view about the Chinese company Huawei. It's there's a debate here in Canada actually about that company. Some people say there's no issue. Other ones say yes. So the U.S., Australia, New Zealand have decided to ban Huawei. What is your view?
So for FireEye as a company, it's not an issue that we follow, right? We're looking at software threats, not the sort of hardware threats that are alleged. Absolutely, I understand in principle why, particularly for government networks, that you would want all of your telecommunications equipment made by your own country or by a close ally. So I think in principle it makes sense, but I'm not familiar. I don't know anything non-public other than what I read in the newspapers on the Huawei issue. So.
Yeah, I wouldn't comment specifically on Huawei. I would say that we've been dealing with issues of supply chain risk since, I wouldn't want to say how far back in history, but certainly since the dawn of the crypto analytic platform and signals intelligence, supply chain problems have been paramount. There's a diminishing marginal rate of production if you decide you're going to try and pursue every single chip in the universe to make yourself secure. And I think for certain elements of an, like say a national security community or the public safety community, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say we are going to now manufacture a certain number of chips on our own, right? But the cost is quite significant to be, and it alters how people do things economically. So I don't think that you could possibly do so in any kind of global way across sectors for an entire economy. You could probably do it for a number of subsectors.
Thank you, Mr. Parlus. Mr. Dubé, 7 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Chair, and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I apologize for my tardiness and missing your presentations. It's a problem when you're alone here, as you can't separate yourself in two, so I'm stuck with some media upstairs. I do want to ask about the role of the private sector. It's something that's come up quite a bit, and I think it's one of the underlying tensions in this field of navigating what role the public and the private sector have to play. And I'm just wondering if you see any concerns over the fact that a lot of these things are being offered as services, so there's always this notion of wanting to protect what you do best and the clients that you have versus another company operating in the same field. Is there any concern that sort of the regular rules of business and industry might undermine any kind of uniformity or ability to have sort of standard practices and ensure that everyone's sort of on the level playing field when it comes to our own interests here or in the U.S., for example?
Yeah, I think you'll find actually that, at least within the information security community, a large majority of the biggest companies work together on standards and exchange information, even from peer competitors, for example, collecting threat intelligence. You know, we often cooperate behind the scenes in the public good, exchanging information. In terms of standards setting, I mean, standards setting is generally great for existing enterprises. So I guess I don't share your concern. I understand where it would be that way in principle, or in theory it could be that way, but I haven't seen that when I've actually worked in the private sector. I have people I consider good friends and colleagues at many different companies, and you compete for individual contracts, but overall that doesn't hold back standard setting. So I would point, for example, to the Tech Accord community that Microsoft sort of leads. A lot of that public policy work looks at what sort of standards can we as a community have and how can we work together for the public good, still competing for individual contracts and still keeping business competitive secrets to ourselves, you're right, but how can we work together as well to make sure those services do get delivered? The example I always give is that, you know, at least in the States in the Old West, right, banks were relatively undefended from physical threat. As governments have played a larger role and as physical security markets have matured and been more standards and regulation, those physical security companies make more money than ever. That sort of regulation didn't hurt their ability to either provide services or to be successful as businesses.
Yeah, I concur with my colleague's statement that the standards community has done a good job of rising up in this way, and I think the NIST cybersecurity standard that was passed after the initial effort to pass cybersecurity legislation in 2011-2012 was a very positive outcome from an earlier effort to try and come up with a mandate or a set of standards. So I would refer you towards the NIST standard. I would also say that to prevent a focus on one technology or problem or part of the problem against another, the information sharing and analysis organizations and the information sharing and analysis centers that have cropped up within the different sectors has facilitated sector-specific development of cybersecurity requirements. The financial service sector in the United States is in this way the most mature of the bunch, and the FS-ISAC, or the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, is a good resource for understanding how the sector sort of meets its own interests when it comes to cybersecurity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I'm just wondering if, sort of as we look to the future and put it more in lay terms, but I think we talk a lot about the cost of, using services like what you offer other companies to protect, if you're a company, to protect your own data, if you're collecting customer information and whatnot. I think those are some of the high profile cases, but I'm just wondering how you see going forward where some of the risks might not be from a business X stockpiling data for a rewards program, let's say, but more in what they're selling. So in other words, if you're selling any kind of household device, if the proliferation of smart devices and things like that. So is there a concern that there might be a lot of investment, a lot of money spent to protect your own interests, but not necessarily the interests of the end user who is purchasing equipment or devices from a given company? Firmware updates, things like that, right? That would be
I think my concern with the Internet of Things, which I think is what you're describing, the sort of the internet-connected physical devices, I think my concern there, my number one concern is that many of those devices are not updatable at all. Even if you discover a flaw in them, it's not technically possible to go in and fix it. So that's an incentive on the manufacturer where there's limited liability for flaws that are discovered in their products in a way that you wouldn't tolerate for a physical threat, for example, or a flaw in a manufacturing defect. So I do have concerns with that as a threat vector. In terms of the proper market incentives, that's, I guess I was a business major, so I should have a better answer, but that's not what I focus on every day. I'm thinking from a threat perspective, and what I think threat groups are going to be focused on is how can they cause that physical disruption in ways that undermine entire communities and societies. I'm much less concerned about the everyday kind of criminal malware that could affect those physical devices and more concerned about that creates a very intimate way for foreign governments, for example, to disable physical devices in your home as an individual citizen. And I would propose that sort of public safety issue is first and foremost a government responsibility.
So would you argue in favor of there being, we talked about standards earlier, some kind of standard, almost like in the same way, if a vehicle is going on the road, there are standards that are expected for safety. It should be the same thing if you're selling a phone or things like that, given this new reality that we're living in.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
When it comes to cybersecurity, it does help to look at the data center and the cloud environment. First, there's a tendency to think about the end result, like IP theft or data destruction or data manipulation, any one of which could make a sci-fi movie and keep all of us up at night. If, however, you start with the data center itself and say, how am I securing how servers interact from the interior? How am I preventing intruders from moving laterally throughout an environment? You're actually covering all those bases. And I mean, yes, that's what my company does, but the reason why I joined Illumio is because having worked in the Pentagon and looked at the range of disruptions that could happen, whether it's to a weapons platform or the financial sector or the economy, you really want to start in the worst case place. Like if an intruder breaks into a data center and can move around unencumbered, everything is on the table. So yes to standards, and actually the French government has been very forward-leaning in that regard for securing data centers, and other countries have as well. And if you start there, then everything else, even an intrusion like into an IoT in someone's home, will ultimately connect back to a server, and so that could be prevented.
Right, okay.
Mr. Dubé, Mr. Picard, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, gentlemen. When we face a terrorist event, we usually know who hit and most of the time the reasons why. Our country has been involved in their country. We have taken position against their policies and so on. If I was a private corporation and financial service provider, my question would be, what kind of a threat do I represent to foreign interests? So I become a target for cybercrime because I'm my own business. I do have branches in every country, but I don't impact anyone's wealth and from the government standpoint. So I don't know where the hit comes from. I don't understand why I'm being targeted. Is it because cybercrime is a national sport at this country, or because plain bank robbery, just take my money virtually? I'm not sure that the private corporation do understand the full picture of what they represent, how it works, so they can address the right solution.
Yeah, I share your concern, and I agree with you. I think many, even companies in the finance sector that have fairly sophisticated security organizations internal to themselves, I feel like oftentimes that they don't see the threats coming. They know that threats in general are coming, but to your point, the particular reasons why they suffer a breach or are targeted for attack often have nothing to do with that institution. Perhaps it's because the foreign threat is doing it to get back at the Canadian government for some action that they did. Or just as commonly these days, it's for economic competitiveness reasons. So those Canadian financial institutions may not be harming anyone else, but there may be someone, another bank in another country or another investor that wants to outcompete those Canadian institutions. And if they can't do it fairly in the open market, maybe they can get help from a cyber threat group, for example. So unfortunately, Canada's financial institutions are targeted not necessarily because they're doing anything other than for cybercrime. Obviously, that's where the money is. But when it's a nation state doing it, it's often for economic competitiveness that they want to either learn from or outcompete those institutions when making foreign investments. Or it could be for political retribution, even for something that happens in a different country. The flip side of being in a strong alliance is that if a hacker finds a vulnerability in a Canadian financial institution, they could use that to propagate a political message against another member of NATO, for example. It could have nothing to do with that institution at all. That's why it's so important to have the close tie between, Canada's security services, which are going to have better insight into those motivations, and the private sector.
I think it helps to start by thinking like an adversary, right? Whether you're a government or an organization who's thinking about threats overall, you need to go through what is an adversary, how are they going to try and hold me at risk? What are they going to try and do to me? And what am I willing to lose? Because once you have a sense of like what your core interests are and what you're willing to lose and what you need to protect, then you can start building out a strategy for investment. And within the United States, so that doesn't quite get you there to answer your question, however. Within the United States, we passed an executive order about cybersecurity that called out something called the Section 9 list. And the Department of Homeland Security conducted an assessment of all the companies and organizations in the country that were most cyber vulnerable and whose impact, if they were disrupted, would cause the most significant damage. That analysis led to a list, which is classified. It's not a very large number of companies. You could probably guess a number of them right off the bat. And that also helped the government focus on its collaboration with those key companies, right? And that way you could say, we're going to ensure that the cyber defenses of these companies are going to be hardened. That does not mean then that those are the only companies that the country would focus on, right? The military, for example, has to focus on it has to look at the adversaries, Russia, Iran, North Korea in particular, and say, what are they investing in? What are they going to go after? And what are they going to try and do? And then you have to try and blunt and block them if they do something quite significant. That also doesn't quite get us there. And this is where regulation has to come in, because if you've hardened the most valuable companies in a country, if the military is watching the most valuable adversaries, it's the internet. It's massive. Someone's going to try and hack somewhere else, and they're always going to look for the weakest underbelly, wherever they can go. A great example here is Iran in 2012. The United States was prepared for Iran to do all sorts of things during the nuclear negotiations. What Iran did, which was you were able to prognosticate that they would do this, is they went after the infrastructure in the Persian Gulf of Saudi Aramco, and they hacked Saudi Aramco, as been publicly reported. That's where regulation absolutely has to come in and say, there have to be breach management requirements. There have to be penalties if companies don't meet these breach management requirements, and you have to be able to meet certain sort of resiliency investments to defend against breach.
What are our chance of fighting at the same level as our enemies, considering that some of them are state-sponsored initiative where budget is no object. So my concern in Canada, budget is a concern.
The good news in cybersecurity is we can control our own terrain. And what that means is that, if you think like an adversary and you think, what is the adversary going to try and do? They have their terrain where they're launching attacks from the offense. And that's not the duty of the private sector to be concerned with. That's the duty of governments. But as an organization, whether you're a government organization or otherwise, you can reorder and configure your terrain to harden yourself quite significantly against an attack, which means you set up your perimeter defense, you have your firewalls, you're encrypting your email, you have multi-factor authentication for your users, and you invest in this microsegmentation capability. That way, if somebody breaks past your defenses, they're going to be stopped in their tracks inside your data center or your cloud. And if you've done all of that and you've invested in cyber insurance, you're going to have taken some really very strong steps. Now, you would assume then that talking to a bank or a major institution that they would have done this. The amount of times where I give an address to a cybersecurity community and I say, please raise your hand and tell me how many of you use multi-factor authentication and it's less than 20% is almost every time. How many of you encrypt your emails? Also very low numbers. So this does get to the sort of nudging and regulatory demand. I think, though, that if we take these steps, we can put ourselves up into a significant advantage against those that would try and intrude against us. And you can block 95% of the intrusions that would happen or prevent the damage from 95% of the intrusions that would happen. There does ultimately have to be a partnership with the government in order to impose sanctions or punitive measures in the cases where you may not be able to do so as an organization.
Thank you.
Mr. Picard, Mr. Motts, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Porter, if we're considered basically a country of being a first target, would that not increase the need for us to really be at the forefront of cyber defense? So despite our smaller population and our budget restraints, how can Canada really increase its edge above our counterparts or in an effort to defend ourselves? And how is that possible? Can you cite some best practices that we might be able to look at from around the world?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. The good news and bad news is that because cyber policy is still so nascent and your allies are still grasping at something that will actually work, Canada has an opportunity de facto to be a leader in this field by finding a solution that works. I think that's absolutely achievable. So I'll start by reorienting the question just a little bit. I think within the NATO alliance, there's a general attitude that governments will learn secret things and they will take some action to defend their own networks mostly, and then maybe companies and individuals as well. And maybe occasionally they will declassify that and share that with companies. And that process is typically very slow, very long term. In the private sector, if we don't turn around actionable threat intelligence in 48 hours, we really have kind of let our clients down. And I think governments typically operate on timelines of several months. In some cases for good reason. I'm not going to pretend like it's that there's not good reasons for doing that. There often are. But I would encourage you to think that everything I just said about the finance or about cyber intelligence sharing was once true of counterterrorism, for example, until with threats to aviation and of course with 9/11, there was a much greater emphasis to push that information out to local governments, to individual actors and companies. In the U.S., much greater information sharing and declassification. I think we need the same thing in cyber threat intelligence, where the allies are willing to tolerate more risk and push that defensive information out to the private sector more rapidly. So I think it's unrealistic to think that a small business, for example, large enterprises maybe, but a small business would be able to keep up with changes in major threats in a competent way. But between the large private sector cybersecurity companies and better information sharing from the government to those key partners, I think that would go a long way. You would have to tolerate some risk, of course, but the current situation where governments tend to view themselves as the central repository for information and will collect everything and then tell you what to do about it. In cyberspace, that's just not how things work. Governments are still the largest actors, but they're not the only ones.
Good, thank you for that. I only got a limited amount of time. Mr. Raber, in your experience here with Canadian law, is there anything that exists that you see in our current law structure that is missing that could possibly improve consumer privacy, consumer protection, or our ability to defend our critical infrastructure?
Sir, I wish I was an expert on that question, but I'm going to have to pass. The one thing I will say is, having read your new 2018 cyber strategy, I think it does provide a good platform on which to build for the nation overall, but I'm not so familiar with Canadian law.
All right. What about you, Mr. Porter? Do you have any comment on that?
No, nothing to add to that.
So, Mr. Aber, you had mentioned before the whole concept of micro-segmentation. Is that something that would be expensive for smaller companies to implement?
No, not at all.
Okay. What does it entail? Different servers? A different configuration of your servers?
Sure. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve. Okay. And I would defer to my team for specific pricing models. It's really done on a case by case basis. But the way that I would recommend organizations to start, and one of the things we discovered in our business is most organizations may have some sense of who their crown jewel applications are, like what their most valuable applications are within their universe. For example, if you're the Office of Personnel Management, as I mentioned once before, a database that stores all the data for all the personnel, that would be a key application, right? Once you've identified your most important applications, you want to map out your data center and how all your applications and workloads, which are not quite applications, they're the ones that connect, they provide the connective tissue within your data center for your applications and servers. You want to map them out. And most organizations haven't done that. So if you think about maps as like a key element of geostrategy, the map of your interior, and in order to control your terrain, you have to have this map done. That then shows you how all the applications interact. So if Chris is in the marketing department and I'm the guy who handles the key sauce for whatever my organization is, a payment system or otherwise, and he gets hacked through an email, there's no reason why his server should ever be interacting with mine. Like, he's not concerned. He's not an engineer. I'm the engineer. So in that way, you draw a map of how your applications work, and then you put rules, you set rules for how they interact with one another. The degree to which an organization wants to set rules for specific crown jewel applications across their enterprise, that affects the pricing model to some degree, and that's why I'm not going to offer you like a specific cost. But if you want to map your enterprise and then begin to set rules internally, that's when you really harden your interior. And one of the benefits of setting rules is it provides alarms. So if somebody breaks into one server, and you know that server shouldn't be interacting, if he's hacked as in the marketing department and I'm an engineer, and we know these servers shouldn't be interacting, and you see an intruder doing it, it will set off an alarm. So then the security operations team can know, okay, somebody's inside.
You know you were in a market for microservers? Oh,
Yeah.
gee. Yeah. Oh. Beware of your fridge, though. Ms. Saho? Oh, Ms. DeBruzen, 5 minutes.
Actually, I think you said, you mentioned something about who's outside is where you left it off. And that's actually where I wanted to start, because at our last meeting, we heard from HackerOne. And it was really interesting to hear their perspective on how you can improve systems by having people who have that type of knowledge kind of poke at your systems to figure out where your vulnerabilities are. And they said that legislation is necessary to help provide protections to those. I think they use the term white hat. I'm not crazy about that, but whatever the term you want to use for your good person hacker. Sorry. So I guess my question is, what's your perspective on that, on having legislation that protects these types of hackers and trying to encourage that?
Sure. So the interesting thing about cyberspace, unlike any other domain, is that the brains are really the weapon to a large degree, right? So it's the person and what they know and what they're capable of doing. So yeah, the intention matters a lot. And basically, I think red teaming and penetration testing, which is my preferred term, penetration testing, is absolutely vital for the development of your security strategy. If you've implemented the best capabilities in the world, if you have the new security stack, if you've spent and you've been very smart about it, you always want to have someone who's trying to break into your network, constantly testing it, constantly looking for vulnerabilities, trying to find out, thinking like an adversary and trying to find their way in. I won't weigh into specific recommendations for legislation because it's very complicated, and there's international legislation underway through the Wassenaar agreements and the Wassenaar Accords. Wassenaar. My spelling of German words and Dutch words is not great, but I can find that out for you. The proliferation of malware and penetration testing capabilities globally is a concern because you never know what somebody's going to try and do if they have that kind of knowledge or if they have malware that can allow them to break in. The state of Pennsylvania has a law regulating who gets to use malware and for what purpose. So I certainly think that over time we're going to see an increase in regulation around penetration testing and ownership of malware even for that reason. And it's very complicated to verify why and how somebody has malware on their computer. It could be because it was infected, or it could be because they're going to get up to something. And proving it is really a question of the intention of the person who has it. So it's complicated.
And, Mr. Porter, do you have any thoughts as to the things to watch for or things that would be gained by doing this?
No, I just do want to emphasize my colleague's point that it's helpful to tolerate some risk in terms of, particularly at the university level and younger, allowing people to explore computer security and professional researchers as well without criminalizing their activity. Right? If there's no malicious intent and if there's not deliberate harm, I think there are a number of regulations underway and laws being passed in the States and elsewhere in a good faith attempt to improve cybersecurity, but that have the effect of stifling original research. So I obviously can't comment competently on Canadian law, but just urge you to avoid that impulse to criminalize the, what is essentially math and logic put into electronic form. Don't criminalize that thought process, because those same sort of creative people who are exploring those possibilities are the ones that you hope to one day employ to defend your country as well. So there's nothing you can do that would hurt a relationship with the security community quicker than to sort of criminalize their work or to put a presumption of guilt into what may just be, good-natured intellectual curiosity.
Right. Well, and that actually leads me to the other question, because I believe that might have been you, Mr. Eber, had pointed out that the third part of the problem was not enough human infrastructure, for lack of a better term. So we've heard about this a lot, about how do we build the human capacity to deal with cyber security. And so I was wondering, do you have any tips of what you've seen countries doing well or less well to build that capacity?
Sure. That's a great, the first resource that I would point you towards, just for there's a map that was just produced by NIST. I guess it's the National Institute for Cybersecurity Education in the U.S. that actually maps out population density and the number of users. It's a good resource to go to look at how we're meeting the workforce challenge. I would say, so master's level education and university level education to appropriate technical specifications like Security Plus or CISSP. These are certifications to get people trained to do certain kinds of core cybersecurity functions. And the degree to which community colleges or whatever the appropriate name is in Canada, you'll forgive me, the associate degree, these sorts of institutions that can train people in cybersecurity tasks is incredibly helpful. And the degree to which the federal government can offer either some kind of incentive for universities to initiate those kinds of training programs, we found that to be very helpful. It also helps if you have state universities that are clustered around industries that need to transition. So for us, the manufacturing sector in large parts of the U.S. economy has gone through a massive transition. And so states like Michigan, for example, Michigan State University, should be investing in cybersecurity training for a lot of the auto industry, and the auto industry itself is transitioning into cybersecurity. So finding these corollaries around clusters to where you can then make investments in university training is very helpful. The last thing I would say, the evolution of the Cyber Mission Force, which is our military force, it was initiated in 2012 and it achieved full operational capacity in 2018. These are the individuals who are the sort of high end. There's 6,200, and the investment in this force is actually a major deterrent effort on behalf of the government. The fact that these hackers exist within the military, and they are hackers, it did take them 5 years to get fully trained, though, to get the whole group fully trained. So you had to move people through schoolhouses, and that takes time and effort. So there is a little bit of patience, and that's what ultimately leads me to say focus on securing your most important applications first.
I'd like a few comments, if I may, Mr. Chair.
You could work that into another. Ms. DeBruzen has been very generously allocated time by her chair. Mr. Aglinski, and if you can work your response in at some point.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope you'll give me that leeway too. Thank you.
You're not nearly as charming as Ms.
What?
DeBruzen.
Come on, look at my face. I mean, anyways, thank you, gentlemen, for coming today. It's been very interesting listening to you, and it's actually been a little scary listening to you. I noticed during your presentation, Mr. Reber, that you talked about 4 billion people coming online over the last 35 years. And I think you mentioned somewhere, or I've heard it, that over the next 5 years, we're going to see another 25% coming on, especially with China and India progressing the way they are. And I know, of course, the cyber threats are going to increase with that amount of people coming online. And I know here in Canada, we're not going to see that kind of growth, of course, but it'll be proportionally, I imagine. But being the fact that we know that China is one of our primary adversaries in cyberspace, is very concerning to me, and I think it's concerning to everybody here on this committee. I wonder, what are the top 4 things that we could do as a country that you would recommend that we could do to protect us the best way that you see in the future here?
Okay. I wrote down 2. I'll try and come up with 3 and 4. Great question. The first thing I would say is to protect critical infrastructure and identify the companies and organizations that matter most for the overall health of the economy and the nation's safety. If a country has not embarked on the process of identifying those corporations and entities within the economy, then it's almost like, by analogy, from where we come from within Illumio, you haven't identified your crown jewel applications. So we're looking internally within the organization to say what are the applications that matter most. So that's actually the second thing I would say. The first is identify the most important organizations within the country. Then for those organizations themselves, they need to invest in the whole stack of security for the perimeter and their interior, and they need to identify what their core missions are and figure out how their most important data relates to their core missions. And that's an analytic process that involves the security team, the infrastructure team, multiple components across the organization. And then, so I guess that's 3 things. The first is critical infrastructure, identifying within the country. The third is identifying your core assets within the organization itself. The third is thinking about your mission and being prepared to operate without access to data. That's very important. If you think to yourself, if I lost my data today, what would I not be able to do, and what do I absolutely have to be able to do? And then the 4th thing is what I talked about from a deterrent standpoint. Countries have to think about how to deter nation states from coming after them. Because if you assume breach, which is a mantra that we use, if you assume you're going to be breached, then the best thing to do is to prevent someone from trying to breach you in the first place. If they do breach you, you need to be ready and you need to be secure beyond breach. But to do deterrence is really very, very impressive. And that ultimately, as the internet expands, and it's not just the next billion users in the next 5 years in China and India alone, because we will add 1 billion just between those 2 countries. It's all the connected devices that are going to spin out from all those users as well. So we're not just going to see an expansion of humans, but an expansion of all the technologies that every human is touching.
I have a few brief suggestions, if I may.
Yes.
Yeah. So I have a somewhat different outlook on this, I think, from my colleagues. So in no particular order, things that could be tried that would improve Canada's cybersecurity, put a greater emphasis on diplomacy, right? The solution to every conflict in cyberspace doesn't have to be the threat of military retaliation or sanctions or indictments. I have not seen any evidence that any of those have worked so far. So if we're going to say that those kind of activities successfully deter, why are we're doing those same activities year after year, but then cyber threats continue year after year. So where's the relationship? I'm much more of an optimist on diplomacy than I think others are. Many people. If you called 100 experts, I might be the only one. So it's not 50-50 for sure. The second thing, and back to your question, in terms of people, make sure that when you're recruiting people for government service, that you're not just looking at the same candidates as always, that you're open to a diverse candidate pool, both personally but also in terms of their professional backgrounds. Cyber is a part of everyday life, so it's not just going to be technical people that you need to recruit. It's going to be people with all kinds of backgrounds, right? Economic and political scientists and so forth. And finally, just to emphasize something I said earlier, I think it's a mistake for countries to rely too much on a list of who we're going to defend and who we're not. That's to me, that's a counterinsurgency problem.
Can I just cut you off just
sure.
real quick on that? But I got a real quick question. Your organization, both of them, are private organizations providing security. Are they equal, the bad guys? I'm saying you're the good guy. We got the bad guy organizations out there available to clientele.
Certainly, yes. You can hire services very similar to how you can buy anything else online. Absolutely, that's the market. That's how those markets are designed, particularly for criminals.
Thank you, Alvin, for that.
I didn't know that Washington still thought the diplomacy was important.
Can I just assert
So
that I like
5
diplomacy,
minutes.
by the way, in case anyone's wondering. So.
Is in regards to some of the things I know that all countries have been thinking about, but definitely our government in particular has been thinking about this next upcoming election, interference, influence, and there has been legislation that has required social media companies, platforms to be more transparent as to who's advertising on their platforms. But do you think that there's also been a lot of investment in cybersecurity, which is needed, I think, and even more needs to be done. But what responsibility do you think social media platforms have, and what kind of greater role can they play in terms of protecting people from fraud when they're using their databases, having foreign actors being, invading that space and them not knowing or them not, doing anything about it? So if I could have both your comments on that.
Sure. Most of the large social media companies make significant investments, particularly now, in security, and are doing their best, I think, to root those out. So I can't speak on their behalf, but many of them do make significant investments. It's just also an enormous task for even a very large private sector company to combat sophisticated foreign military government operations. I think that's asking a lot of anybody's security team to do that on their own. I would just reemphasize for Canada's purposes, a lot of the vulnerability isn't just going to be in physical infrastructure, right? Big databases and physical things. Those are certainly vulnerable as well. But individual candidates and campaigns and the parties themselves, those are also prime targets for adversaries that want to interfere in your elections. And if they were being targeted on social media or for disinformation campaigns, I don't know that they have the same level of resources and wherewithal that the infrastructure behind voting would have to support them. So make sure that individual candidates, campaigns, the parties are also supported with some of the same cyber threat intelligence that's provided for the voting mechanisms and infrastructure. I think that's very important. Certainly after 2016, that's where we've seen most of the threats have been social media generated threats, but they've been at individual campaigns, not necessarily at what's being defended, which is government run infrastructure. So that's still a vulnerability, not just in Canada, but throughout the West.
So social media companies have certainly invested quite significantly since 2016. And one of the things that you can read in their open public communications is the degree to which they've built partnerships with the government. And for Canada, I think that for any infrastructure in your country that could be manipulated, that ultimately becomes a very important step for tech companies to take. And so if there isn't already a information sharing infrastructure or public-private cooperation mechanism that exists in advance of that election, I would say we have something called the Enduring Security Framework in the United States, which brings together key IT companies and infrastructure owners and operators with the intelligence community and the national security community to share threat information and design solutions for that's a bit of a longer term thing, but that's one recommendation. The second thing I would say is, at least within our environment within the United States for our election systems, the way that election registration is handled, it's handled by different departments per state. And in those instances where they have not yet done so, organizations need to secure their data centers to prevent people from manipulating the electoral rolls and the registration rolls. So, by analogy for Canada, to figure out who manages voter registration and where they store that data on what server, ultimately will help you to make the right investments for manipulating the actual outcome of the election, right? Another thing that I would say is informing the public very much about what could happen, and say, I think the Department of Justice in the United States was very good at this. Harvard also had a nonprofit program that educated secretaries of state across the country in crisis management. You can find that campaign on Harvard's website. It's the Defending Digital Democracy Project.
When did that happen?
That was over the last 2 years. Yeah. So there's good materials there for how to train election officials to do crisis response and crisis management.
And was that as a result of what happened in the 2016 American election?
It was a direct result of what happened in the 2016 election. The individuals who run that program, and this is just one among many, but the individuals who run that program, both of whom emerged, or a number of whom emerged from the administration. So they were taking the lessons that they'd learned. So I would say the social media component is obviously quite significant, and the Canadian population needs to be educated about potential risks, and that is certainly a part of it. And the social media companies themselves, you should engage them, to work with them so that they can put forward messages on their own platforms in advance to inform their Canadian users what they're doing to prevent election interference. I believe that they're probably already doing that. But that would be another step that you could take. And the last thing I'll say, and I know you're out of time, the next, I'm overly verbal. Yeah. Yeah. The next step is who's going to be manipulated next. Like, elections were one thing, right? The thing that I'm most concerned about is census data, and imagine if, so within the United States, we have our census coming up, I think in 2022 or 2025, I can't remember. Imagine if somebody could break into the research institutions and manipulate demographic data to portray the United States as accelerating one demographic shift or another.
Yeah.
Like, that would alter how we perceive our society overall. So the next step is research institutions that have yet to invest, that do a lot of really valuable research for a country's overall identity. I mean, if I was an adversary, that's exactly where I'd be going, and I hope they're not listening.
Oh, boy.
The white hats and who are the black hats? Mr. Dubé, for a generous 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I
see that. Excuse me. I see that the lights are flashing. That means we have about half an hour. I'll go to Mr. Dubé. I'd like to ask a few questions. My suggestion, colleagues, is to run to 5 or 5:10. Both of our witnesses have come from a long way to talk to us, and there may be follow-up questions. So is that acceptable to colleagues? Mm-hmm. So, Mr. Dubé.
Yeah, thank you. Just really quick, since I have my generous 3 minutes. You mentioned the securing data centers as a way to deal with. I always hate saying the Internet of Things. I feel like I'm in a Mary Poppins movie when I do. But the Internet of Things does securing data centers, does that deal also with data manipulation? Because you've talked a lot about that as well, and I think especially in the context of a study on the financial system, that could be an issue as well.
Yeah, so it very much deals with data manipulation in that in order for you to alter, let's say you're trying to redirect a ship, as the Russians did in the Baltic Sea reportedly. They spoofed GPS and redirected some ships in the Baltic Sea. That's just been reported. Or in the case of electoral rolls, where you're altering who's on a roll and who isn't. Mm-hmm. In order to do that, you need to make your way onto a server, because applications don't just exist sort of in the ether, and I mean that in the least sort of patronizing way possible as I say that. Like, applications and servers are really in many ways one and the same. So anytime you log into a cloud-based server and enter your data, or a cloud-based application and enter your data, it's touching a server somewhere in the world. And so if you've secured a data center from the inside, you're preventing an intruder from being able to move laterally and implant whatever malware for whatever purpose they choose, whether it's manipulation, theft, or destruction.
So you'll forgive my layperson knowledge on this. This study makes us all feel like Luddites, but if someone's not updating their firmware or whatever on I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So the data center being secure is enough even in the event that you have the worst security on your device imaginable, because I just find it hard to square that circle. I don't know if I'm understanding.
Yeah, no, I find that hard as well, because I think part of the issue is that many of the most advanced groups use legitimate credentials, right? They trick, if you're the president of the bank, they trick you into getting your credentials, and then there is no strictly malicious behavior. They're just abusing your credentials. And for the finance sector, the question is, if that were to be discovered one day, how far back could you roll that back? A day, a week, a month? Could you fix the accounts if they were off? So I think manipulation is not so much a criminal issue as it is a potential vulnerability for the finance sector that could pose a systemic risk. To me, it's the number one systemic risk, that data would be manipulated at a major bank, and then you wait a month, you wait a year, and you announce to the public, I had this person's credentials, I changed 2 or 3 accounts. It doesn't really matter. Everybody who thinks their bank, charged too high of a fee one time or another is going to be, challenging everything that's ever happened on their account. So I think it's a real risk. And most organizations, either by virtue of their size, they're so big, they have so much data, or they're so small they can't invest in doing it. They don't know what normal behavior is on their network. And it's very hard to roll back after the fact if you don't have adequate backups. And it's a real risk for the finance sector in particular.
Fair enough.
If I could just
Sure, fine. Go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Is it okay?
I'm being, yes. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll try and be as brief as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not trying to argue that if you secure your data center in the interior, that you're set and you can go home and sleep, right? That's not what I'm saying. There has to be a security stack of investments. In the case of an advanced adversary who knows that if they penetrate the Secretary of Defense or the President or the CEO of an organization, that person has to have very clear, any individual, there has to be some security capability that secures the user at the perimeter, multi-factor authentication, firewalls, all that. My argument that I was saying is if you break past multi-factor authentication or encryption and you make your way in, if you find the low-value server, if you have invested to secure the interior of your data center, you're going to be able to limit damage quite significantly compared to if you haven't. If you haven't done it, forget it. They're going to be able to own any application in your enterprise. If you have done it, you might lose X and Y data, you might lose X and Y servers, but you'll be able to manage that cost. Now, unless it's the President or the Secretary of Defense or whomever it is who's been hacked, if it's a lower level person, the damage will be less.
Okay, that was a generous 3 minutes. Mr. Reiber, as I listened to your presentation, you essentially say that there's various layers of protection, and then you have this micro-segmentation program so that instead of 3,000 access points, you only have 3 access points. In the context of the oncoming 5G network, does that model of security protection still prevail?
So I haven't thought through how 5G would impact our capability overall. And nor do I know enough about 5G to really want to advise you on it. I would say if I make an assumption and set my own fictional narrative and say 5G is going to speed up our ability to transmit data, that should not impact the propositions that I'm making. And I would say that they still stand. Meaning that if it's simply the speed through which data is being moved, then if you still set rules and policy for how your applications and servers interact, they're a little bit different. They're 2 different beasts, and they shouldn't negatively impact one another. If I was going to think about a capability that would disrupt the future of computing overall, leaving aside microsegmentation, I think quantum computing would be the main thing that I would be looking into. For something that would totally alter the nature of cybersecurity. Even then, I don't think the security stacks would be totally disrupted.
Thank you. Mr. Porter, you're obviously familiar with the Article 5 in NATO's treaty, and these cyber attacks can happen in microseconds. You may be at war and you don't even know that you're at war. Do you think that the architecture as described in NATO, which is a treaty that's somewhere in the order of 50 years old, is adequate for responses on cyber attacks and it's already happened. The example would be Estonia. Do you think that treaty needs to be seriously revamped?
Mr. Chair, I think the mechanisms in the treaty allow for appropriate joint policy responses by the NATO members. I think a bigger issue is who's going to call for such a response and under what circumstances. So I think, at least in the States, you're always waiting for a cyber Pearl Harbor, a major destructive event. And it's much more akin to cyber trench warfare. Only the people in the trenches are private citizens and companies, not soldiers and government actors. So what do you do with that? I think that's the problem that the alliance has right now, is not the legal mechanisms for invoking joint defense. That's being worked through, and I think in a true emergency case would be invoked anyway correctly. I think the bigger issue is, again, you could die a death by 1,000 cuts, and no one would ever think it was worth raising as an Article 5 issue. A second, much more, I think, tactical kind of issue to consider is that the U.S. and Canada both have significant cybersecurity, intelligence capabilities in the private sector and in the government, but not all of the NATO allies do. So if there were a major cyber incident and you wanted to invoke Article 5, how would we convince the other NATO members that anything had happened or that we had correctly attributed the event? We might be highly confident in the U.S. and Canada and our joint analytic work on that issue. Many countries don't have enough people on the other side of the table to receive and interpret it and take a political action. Do they have the kind of experts that we do? I think that's an issue. How do you share that capability to understand and interpret cyber attribution of major cyber attacks? Those are the two issues to me.
Okay. And my final question is that the U.S. Congress has basically reacted to the Huawei issue by absorbing the idea that a cyber attack by China would be so fast and so devastating that it would, if you will, be over before it began. Is that your view as well?
Mr. Chair, I think if you were constrained to only conducting such a conflict by cyber means, that might be a reasonable interpretation. But while there are significant risks, obviously responses to cyber attacks don't have to be limited to that domain. I would defer to my colleague on how that would play out in the real world. But I don't necessarily share quite that defeatist view, no, because of the other more conventional options that the United States would have to respond.
Mr. Reiber, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I also I don't endorse the view that that China would simply win a cyber war instantly. I think certainly multiple countries have developed the capability to conduct destructive attacks on critical infrastructure globally. Of the lot, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, the one that I'm by and far the most worried about is Russia. And the reason is because they've implanted malware across elements of the U.S. electric grid, and it wasn't clear why. I don't think that with any one of these adversaries, if they initiated a conflict in cyberspace, that it would terminate in a manner favorable to their terms so quickly, because we've invested in the Cyber Mission Force, and that's a large capability of 6,200 elitely trained hackers and operators who are watching those countries quite closely. But if you go through an escalation ladder, right, if you consider China and Russia in particular, China even more so, they're deeply intertwined with our economy. And they know that any element of escalation in cyberspace that goes beyond a certain level is going to begin to have significant economic consequences for them if it leads to any kind of military confrontation. I recently wrote a piece about why I think China is the greatest long-term threat in cyberspace. And really it's because of their advanced weapons development in other domains like railguns. And it's for that reason that the U.S. invested in the third offset strategy that Sean Brimley led. If we look over the 20-year span of what could happen between these two countries, there is an element of keeping parity in terms of technological development. But to my colleague's point, the way that this is an outcome that you want to obviously avoid. It's not something that's in either country's long-term interests. It's in both of our interests from the United States and China's standpoint, and also for Canada, I imagine, to maintain productive, peaceful relations that over time will lead to the economic flourishing of everybody in the Pacific and beyond. And that ultimately comes down to issues of diplomacy and speaking to them about what escalation means and what it doesn't. In our back pocket, however, we do have to preserve these technological options for the potential for conflict, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Spengeman, you wanted to ask a question?
Please, Mr. Chair, thank you very
And-
much. I'll be brief. I just wanted to get you on the record. This is the Public Safety Committee, and going back to business and potentially even small business, large business to small business crime, cybercrime. Could you talk a bit about the basic law enforcement model? I mean, first of all, starting with the lack of reporting, I think you've addressed that in part through your point that we need to look at breach management requirements as a way to encourage companies to, first of all, report cybercrime incidents. Secondly, the collection of evidence. And then thirdly, prosecutions. Are there prosecutions underway that stay within the North American context? Because I think it's terribly difficult if we have foreign actors or foreign-based companies. But what about the basic law enforcement model in its application to cybercrime in 2019? Any thoughts on that?
Sure, I'll be very brief on this. The FBI plays a very important role in prosecuting cybercrimes within the United States and from the National Security Division for actors from the outside that conduct attacks against the U.S. As far as I know, they're the only agency within the national security community that has the authority to conduct cyberspace operations to shut down a server inside the U.S. We do have a tradition of gathering evidence within the Department of Justice, and the FBI and the Department of Justice working very closely together. And I wish I could refer you to a case to give you a good example right now, but I can certainly find more to send to you. But this is
capacity is there,
yeah,
staffing is there.
Yeah, definitely. It's since the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. I want to say it was in the 80s, but I'm probably wrong about that. Don't ever do math in public or cite dates that you don't know. But since the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, when people inside the U.S. were doing hacking against targets. So a good example is the Dyn example, right? If you were familiar with the attack, it was so significant. It slowed down Netflix, Twitter, these vital organizations, and everyone was wringing their hands. And the Director of National Intelligence went on the record saying this was such a bad threat. It was 3 people in the United States who I think are now doing community service, helping the government deal with cyber attacks. So this is led by an enterprising FBI agent out of Anchorage, Alaska, who was, the way the FBI works, the different offices around the country have the ability to do these investigations, and they did all their forensics and they figured out who it was.
Mr. Porter, any quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly the RCMP has significant technical capabilities to investigate those crimes on their own, and FireEye supports a variety of investigations in Canada at a technical level. I would just add that I can't speak to Canada per se, but in the States, it's very important that victimized companies feel comfortable sharing information, that they're either indemnified or that it won't be held against them. That's vital if you want that threat information, particularly if you think that whatever case it is not just a criminal issue, but could be a national security issue. You want to be clear in law that it's okay to share breach information without that being held against the company individually.
Thank you, Mr. Spengeman. We have about 15 minutes before the vote. So, Mr. Balus, the final question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're here to have a study about especially the banking sector. And then when we have our meeting in California, you talk about the French, they have strong, aggressive measures against the cyber threats. Could you explain a bit? And then last question about your banks in the U.S. Actually, did the U.S. banking is well protected, or they need more protection, and how Canada can be better?
Sure. I think a number of nations have passed stringent regulations to help protect critical infrastructure. The French example for ANSI and the directives that have been developed, I think, is a very good example. And my sense is that they have greater amounts of control over their critical infrastructure from a mandate standpoint than the United States does. Our example, as I mentioned earlier, stems from the Section 9 list, where we went through and said, what is the most important critical infrastructure in the U.S. From a protection standpoint? We do not yet have a national data and privacy protection law in the United States. We have, for breach management, we have our states. Each state has a different role. California and Colorado have passed this more aggressive version. GDPR is very aggressive from that standpoint, mandating a very short period of time to prove that you've got a breach under control and levying a penalty if you haven't. So I think the French example, GDPR, and the California and Colorado state regulations, state laws are really the most progressive and have fairly strong teeth. And that doesn't mean that they've won friends, right? Like a lot of sectors feel now that they have to have a compliance officer to handle all these requirements, and it can be a lot of work. But I think the nature of cyberspace says, look, that's too bad. You're just going to have to do it. From the banking standpoint, I think the interesting thing about the financial sector is it's been under attack since it probably moved over to the internet. And there are a number of major breaches that caught the attention of the national security community as well as the banking sector. And it led the banking sector to invest quite a lot in cybersecurity capabilities. And it's for that reason that they're so far ahead. I may have already commented on this, but they are really much more further advanced than a lot of the other sectors in the U.S. And you could opine that part of the reason is because their workforce, they're able to attract the best talent as well. They're able to pay good salaries. They're able to attract people who want to work hard. My general belief, and this is putting on my historian's hat and looking at all of these sectors, the cyber mission force and the evolution of cybersecurity strategy. When I first started working on this in 2010, around the time when I mentioned Sean Brimley, you couldn't attract people to work in the cyber policy office in the Pentagon. It was a bunch of nerds. Everybody thought it was just computer geeks. Now it's a problem that affects all of us, right? And my view is we now attract such talented people across sectors that we're going to be able to solve this problem. I really think we're going to be able to solve it. And people will be able to implement good technologies. And the banking sector will have led the way, and someday somebody will write a history of the banking sector where people on the inside talk about what it was actually like.
Thank you, Mr. Palouse. Mr. Picard has a critical question here.
Yes, and a technical yes or no question. Do you gentlemen have an Alexa gadget at home? Or Google Home?
Yeah. If I had my druthers, I wouldn't have a television.
Yeah, seconded. If I may, I would like to answer his question as well. The U.S. finance sector is well defended, but it's not just about making an investment, money, technology. It's also about how empowered are the people. If the Security Operations Center at a major financial institution in Canada, for example, discovers a problem, are they empowered to go down and stop trading? That could be millions of dollars to stop trading, to remediate a problem. So the two companies in the same sector across the street from each other spending the same amount of money on security can have very different outcomes depending on how empowered the people are to affect particularly trading operations. I would just add as an aside, bigger than the finance sector, but still a systemic threat to Canada's economy. Most companies that I talk to wish they could invest more in cybersecurity, but they don't feel like they can justify publicly traded companies because in the short term, it hurts their bottom line, right? It's viewed as a cost center. That's an area where regulation helps because absent that regulation or industry standards, there's a first mover disadvantage. Investing in cybersecurity actually hurts your perceived return. So those are two things to consider that disincentivize proper cybersecurity.
Well, with that, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. I want to, on behalf of the committee, thank both you, Mr. Porter from Washington and Mr. Reber from California, for your efforts to get here. It has been very informative. I do feel a little like Mr. Dubé that this is, feel a bit like a Luddite listening to some of this, but hopefully over time we'll become a little bit better than that. So again, thank you for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Meeting adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good job.